25 years is a long time to keep a promise to someone who is no longer there. In a quiet farming community in rural Ohio, a mother spent 2.5 decades observing a birthday for a daughter who was supposed to be gone forever. Every summer, Sarah Brooks baked a small vanilla cake. She never lit the candles. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, wrote a letter she knew she could never mail, and placed it inside a heavy wooden memory box. Inside that box rested a stack of fading kindergarten worksheets, a few photographs, and the uneven printed letters of a 5-year-old child learning to spell her own name. It was a private ritual of grief, performed in a town where everyone else had slowly learned to move on. The local police had long since archived the files. The missing posters that once covered every storefront window had faded and peeled away decades ago. Everyone believed the tragic story of Hannah Brooks had ended in the summer of 1995. Then came the afternoon of Hannah's 30th birthday. The postal carrier drove his familiar route down the gravel road, leaving a small stack of mail inside the Brooks family mailbox. Hidden between utility bills and advertisements was an ordinary white envelope. It carried a postmark from a state nearly 600 miles away. There was no return address. When Sarah opened it, she found a simple, inexpensive birthday card. Written inside, in pencil, was a single word: Mom. What made Sarah's breath catch in her throat was not just the arrival of the card. It was the handwriting. The letters were shaky, uneven, and pressed hard into the paper. The letters were shaky, uneven, and pressed hard into the paper. The H leaned slightly to the left. The A was written with a distinct, looping curve. It was an exact, undeniable match to the 5-year-old handwriting preserved inside the wooden memory box on her kitchen counter. How does a child vanish from her own front yard in broad daylight without leaving a single footprint behind? And more importantly, how does an adult send a letter a quarter of a century later using the exact same elementary handwriting she possessed on the day she disappeared? To understand how a family could spend 25 years living inside a ghost story, you have to understand the world Hannah was born into. In 1995, the rural stretches of central Ohio felt insulated from the dangers of the rest of the country. This was a place defined by endless acres of corn, narrow 2-lane highways, and a silence so deep you could hear a vehicle approaching from a mile away. The Brooks family farm sat at the end of a long dirt driveway, surrounded by fields that had been in David Brooks's family for generations. David was a quiet, hard-working man who measured his life by seasons and harvests. He had inherited the property a decade earlier, taking over the land and expanding the boundaries to build a future for his young family. Sarah was a former elementary school teacher who had traded her classroom for the demanding, full-time job of running a farm household. At the center of their world was Hannah. Hannah was 5 years old, with bright blonde hair that always seemed to escape her braids. She was not a wanderer. Unlike some farm children who constantly pushed boundaries, exploring deep into the woods or climbing onto dangerous equipment, Hannah was timid. She preferred the safety of the front porch. She liked routine. She found comfort in familiar things. Her most prized possession was a soft, gray stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. The rabbit had seen better days. A few months earlier, the family's aging golden retriever had gotten hold of it, tearing the left ear nearly off. Hannah had been inconsolable until Sarah sat down with a needle and heavy black thread, carefully stitching the fabric back together. The repair was visible and slightly clumsy, but Hannah loved the rabbit even more afterward. She told her mother that the stitches meant he was brave. The morning of August 12, 1995, began like any other humid Midwestern summer day. The sky was a pale, hazy blue. The heat was already rising from the asphalt by 9 o'clock. David woke before dawn, drinking his coffee in the dark before heading out to repair a broken irrigation line on the far side of the property. Sarah spent the morning tending to the house, doing laundry, and preparing for the week ahead. By noon, the temperature had reached 90 degrees. Hannah was restless. She wanted to be outside, but she knew she wasn't allowed to leave the perimeter of the front yard without an adult. Sarah gave her a small plastic bottle of liquid soap and a plastic wand. Hannah sat on the front porch steps, dipping the wand and blowing iridescent bubbles into the heavy summer air. She laughed as the wind caught them, carrying them across the dry grass toward the gravel road. The old golden retriever was asleep in the shade beneath the porch, occasionally thumping his tail against the wood when Hannah spoke to him. It was a picture of absolute, ordinary safety. At 12:15, Sarah stepped onto the porch. She wiped her hands on her apron and told Hannah she was going inside to make sandwiches for lunch. She asked Hannah to stay right on the grass where she could see her. Hannah nodded, her attention already focused on a cluster of bubbles floating toward the mailbox. Sarah walked back into the kitchen. The screen door slammed shut behind her. She walked to the refrigerator. She pulled out a loaf of bread, some turkey, and a jar of mustard. She turned on the faucet to rinse a few grapes. The water ran for perhaps 30 seconds. She turned her head to look out the window above the sink. The yard was empty. The plastic bubble wand was resting on the bottom step of the porch. The bottle of soap was sitting upright on the grass. The dog was still asleep in the shade. But Hannah was gone. Sarah dried her hands on a towel. She didn't feel panic yet. Parents of young children know that kids can vanish from sight in an instant, hiding behind a bush, chasing a butterfly around the side of the house, or simply crouching down in the tall grass. She opened the screen door and stepped back onto the porch. She called Hannah's name. The only answer was the loud metallic hum of the cicadas in the nearby trees. Sarah walked down the steps. She checked the side of the house near the garden hose. She walked to the large oak tree near the driveway. She called out again, her voice slightly louder this time. The dog opened one eye, looked at her, and closed it again. A cold sensation began to spread through Sarah's chest. The farm was large, but the front yard was flat and highly visible. There were no deep ditches. There were no large vehicles to hide behind. The cornfields were tall, but the stalks were dense and sharp. Hannah hated the corn. She always complained that the leaves scratched her arms. She would never walk into the fields alone. Sarah began to run. She ran to the back of the house. She checked the open doors of the machine shed. She called out toward the tree line that bordered the property. The silence of the farm, which had always felt peaceful, suddenly felt immense and terrifying. She ran back inside the house, calling Hannah's name down the hallway, opening closet doors, checking beneath the beds, checking the basement stairs. Nothing. It had been less than 5 minutes since Sarah last saw her daughter standing on the grass. She picked up the wall phone in the kitchen and dialed the number for the neighbor's house, knowing David was working near their shared property line. When the neighbor answered, Sarah's voice was trembling. She asked him to find David immediately. 10 minutes later, a pickup truck came tearing down the dirt driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. David slammed the truck into park before it had even fully stopped. He left the door hanging open and ran toward the house. For the next hour, David and Sarah tore their property apart. David drove his four-wheeler along the edges of the cornfields, his eyes scanning the dirt for small footprints. He waded into the creek at the back of the property, terrified of what he might find beneath the murky water. Sarah walked up and down the county road, calling her daughter's name until her voice grew hoarse and tears blurred her vision. At 1:45 in the afternoon, David walked back into the kitchen. His clothes were soaked with sweat and creek water. He looked at his wife, and neither of them needed to speak. The time for assuming their daughter had simply wandered off was over. David picked up the phone and dialed the county sheriff. Sheriff Jim Miller knew the Brooks family well. In a county with fewer than 10,000 residents, the sheriff was less of a distant authority figure and more of a community caretaker. When the call came over the dispatch radio about a missing 5-year-old at the Brooks farm, Miller felt a heavy knot form in his stomach. He arrived at the property within 15 minutes, the light bar on his cruiser flashing silently. 2 deputies pulled in right behind him. Miller approached David and Sarah in the driveway. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He asked specific, methodical questions. What exactly was she wearing? Denim overalls, a yellow t-shirt, and white sneakers. What time did you last see her? 12:15. Did you hear any cars on the road? No. Did the dog bark? No. Miller understood the grim statistics of missing children. If a child wandered away, the primary dangers were exposure, water, and accidents. If a child was taken, the first 3 hours were the only window that mattered. By 3 o'clock, the quiet farm had transformed into a chaotic command center. Word spread through the rural telephone lines with astonishing speed. Neighbors left their own tractors idling in the fields and drove toward the Brooks property. Local shop owners locked their doors and drove out to help. Within 2 hours, more than 100 volunteers had gathered in the front yard, holding walking sticks, flashlights, and canteens of water. Sheriff Miller organized them into grid lines. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the cornfields and began to walk. The sound of 100 people pushing through the dry, rustling stalks echoed across the valley. They checked old wells. They checked abandoned barns on neighboring properties. They checked the drainage culverts beneath the county highways. Among the volunteers was Walter Dawson. Walter lived alone on a smaller property about 2 miles down the road. He was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 50s. He was the kind of neighbor who rarely attended social events but always showed up when someone needed a fence repaired or a truck pulled out of the mud. He wore worn denim work clothes and a faded baseball cap. When the deputies asked for volunteers to walk the creek line, Walter silently nodded, took a heavy flashlight from the bed of his truck, and spent hours wading through the thick mud searching for any sign of the little girl. As the afternoon dragged on, the oppressive heat began to break, replaced by long, stretching shadows. If you want to follow more true stories of complex investigations and unsolved mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel. At 6 o'clock, a specialized canine search team arrived from the state police headquarters. The handler approached Sarah and asked for an unwashed piece of Hannah's clothing. Sarah walked into her daughter's bedroom. It looked exactly as it had that morning. A picture book was left open on the floor. The bed was unmade. She picked up a worn sweater from the hamper, her hands shaking violently, and carried it outside to the handler. The search dog, a highly trained bloodhound, sniffed the sweater and was led to the front porch. The dog immediately picked up a scent. It lowered its head, its tail rigid, and began tracking across the front grass. David and Sarah stood on the porch, holding their breath. Sheriff Miller followed the dog closely. The bloodhound tracked a path straight from the porch steps toward the county road. It moved with purpose, indicating a strong, fresh scent. It reached the edge of the property where the green grass met the gray, dusty gravel of the road. Then the dog stopped. It paced back and forth along the edge of the gravel of the road. Then the dog stopped. It paced back and forth along the edge of the gravel. It whined, sniffing the air, and spun in a tight circle. The handler guided the dog across the road, into the ditch on the other side, and down the asphalt shoulder. But the dog showed no interest. The scent didn't fade gradually. It simply ended, right at the edge of the road. Sheriff Miller crouched down and inspected the gravel. The road was bone dry. The dust was completely undisturbed. There were no skid marks. There were no deep tire tracks indicating a vehicle had pulled onto the shoulder in a hurry. Miller stood up and looked back at the farmhouse. He looked at the old golden retriever still resting quietly near the porch steps. A horrifying realization began to settle over the veteran lawman. A child who wanders off leaves a continuous trail. A child taken by a violent stranger screams, struggles, and leaves physical evidence of a disturbance. The dog on the porch would have barked at the sound of a struggle or the approach of a strange, loud vehicle. But Hannah's scent simply vanished into the air, as though she had willingly stepped off the grass and into a vehicle she completely trusted. Night finally fell over the Ohio Valley. The farm was illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of police floodlights. Generators hummed loudly in the darkness. Sarah Brooks sat on her porch steps, staring at the plastic bottle of bubble soap that remained untouched on the grass, realizing her daughter was out there somewhere in the dark. The volunteers continued searching through the night, their flashlight beams cutting through the trees like searchlights. But Sheriff Miller was no longer looking at the fields. He was looking at the people standing in the yard. The next morning, as exhaustion set in and the realization that Hannah was truly gone took hold, a deputy reviewing dispatch logs noticed a minor detail that had been overlooked in the chaos of the first few hours. It was a brief statement from a retired mail carrier who drove the route just before noon. He had mentioned seeing something near the Brooks farm, but he hadn't stopped because it looked entirely normal. When investigators finally sat down to ask him what he saw, his answer changed the entire direction of the search, forcing detectives to abandon the idea of a stranger and turn their attention toward the very people who were pretending to help them search. Arthur Vance had driven the rural postal delivery route for nearly 3 decades. He knew the make and model of every vehicle in the county. He knew which farm dogs would chase his tires and which ones would sleep through the sound of his engine. He knew the daily rhythms of the families who lived along the quiet stretches of dirt roads. When Sheriff Miller sat down with Arthur the morning after Hannah Brooks disappeared, the retired carrier offered a detail that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the investigation. Arthur explained that he had driven past the Brooks driveway at approximately 12:10 in the afternoon. The sun was bright, creating a harsh glare on the windshields of parked cars. Arthur noticed a vehicle pulled onto the gravel shoulder near the Brooks family mailbox. He could not see the driver, but he clearly saw 5-year-old Hannah standing near the edge of the grass. She was not running. She was not crying. Arthur described her posture as completely relaxed. She was holding her repaired stuffed rabbit in one hand and pointing toward the ditch with the other, talking animatedly through the open passenger window of the vehicle. Sitting just a few feet away from her, the family's old golden retriever was resting on its haunches, its tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the dirt. Dogs do not lie about danger. A protective farm dog will bark at a stranger, pace nervously, or place itself between a child and an unknown vehicle. But the retriever was calm. Hannah was smiling. Whoever was sitting inside that vehicle was someone they both recognized and trusted implicitly. Sheriff Miller thanked Arthur for his time, walked out of the interview room, and felt a heavy weight pressed down on his chest. The terrifying reality of cases involving missing children is that stranger abductions are incredibly rare. When a child vanishes without a struggle, without a scream, and without leaving behind any physical evidence of a disturbance, the list of suspects shrinks dramatically. Miller realized the massive volunteer search operation had likely been a mistake. By inviting the entire community onto the Brooks farm, law enforcement had potentially allowed the person responsible to walk right through the crime scene, contaminating evidence under the guise of helping. Miller drove back to the farmhouse to deliver this theory to David and Sarah. Sitting at their kitchen table, he explained that they needed to stop looking for a random predator traveling the interstate. They needed to look closer to home. Sarah stared at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped tightly around a cold mug of coffee. The idea that someone who had sat in their living room, eaten at their table, or waved to them in church had taken their daughter was a different kind of horror. It meant the betrayal was personal. David simply nodded, his eyes hollow, and began writing down a list of every person who had visited the property in the last 6 months. Farmhands, delivery drivers, extended relatives, neighbors. The command center in the front yard was dismantled. The volunteers were thanked and sent home. This quiet dismissal sent a ripple of deep unease through the community. The town of less than 10,000 people suddenly found itself entirely consumed by paranoia. People who had left their front doors unlocked for decades began turning the deadbolts before dinner. Neighbors looked at each other differently in the aisles of the local grocery store. The shared trust that defined rural living began to fracture. Detectives began quietly retracing the routes leading away from the Brooks farm, knocking on the doors of every house within a 5-mile radius. They were looking for anyone who had been looking out a window between 12:15 and 12:30 that afternoon. They found Martha Hayes. Martha was a 72-year-old widow whose small farmhouse sat near the 4-way intersection 2 miles south of the Brooks property. She spent most of her summer afternoons sitting in a rocking chair on her screened-in porch, enjoying the breeze and watching the occasional tractor drive past. When detectives asked if she remembered seeing any traffic on the day Hannah disappeared, Martha nodded. She recalled seeing a brown pickup truck driving away from the direction of the Brooks farm. It caught her attention because it was moving slightly below the speed limit, which was unusual for local drivers on a straight county road. Martha did not see the license plate. She did not see the driver's face. But in a farming community, vehicles are as recognizable as the people who drive them. She noted that the truck had a distinctive dent on the rear quarter panel, just above the tire, and a tailgate that was faded from years of sun exposure. She also mentioned seeing the silhouette of a small child sitting in the passenger seat. She had assumed David Brooks was taking Hannah into town for ice cream, or perhaps giving a ride to a neighbor's child. The description of the truck was painfully specific. Every deputy in the sheriff's department recognized it immediately. It belonged to Walter Dawson. Walter was the quiet, unassuming neighbor who had spent the previous night wading through knee-deep mud in the creek behind the Brooks farm, shining his heavy flashlight into the dark water, searching for Hannah until his voice gave out. 2 deputies were dispatched to Walter's property. They found him in his barn, organizing heavy wooden fencing posts. When they asked him to come down to the station to answer a few routine questions, Walter did not argue. He calmly placed his tools on a workbench, washed his hands at the outdoor spigot, and climbed into the back of the cruiser. Inside the interrogation room, Walter appeared physically broken by the events of the past 2 days. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled slightly as he held a paper cup of water. Sheriff Miller did not treat the interview like an interrogation. He spoke softly, treating Walter like a grieving friend. Miller asked Walter to walk him through his exact movements on the afternoon of August 12. Walter explained that he had spent the early morning repairing a tractor. Around noon, he realized he needed a replacement drive belt. He washed up, got into his brown pickup truck, and drove into town to the hardware store. When Miller asked which route he took, Walter stated he drove the state highway, bypassing the dirt road that ran past the Brooks farm entirely. Miller leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He told Walter that a neighbor had seen a truck, matching his exact description, driving away from the Brooks property shortly after 12:15, with a small child in the passenger seat. Walter shook his head slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not become defensive. He simply stated that Martha must have been mistaken, or that another farmer owned a similar vehicle. He reached into his denim jacket pocket and produced a crumpled paper receipt from the hardware store. The receipt was for a heavy-duty drive belt. The timestamp printed at the top read 12:42 in the afternoon. Investigators analyzed the timeline. The hardware store was a 25-minute drive from the Brooks farm. If Walter had taken Hannah at 12:15, he would have had exactly 27 minutes to hide a terrified 5-year-old child, clean his truck, drive into town, walk into the hardware store, and purchase a tractor part with absolute composure. It was a remarkably tight window. Not impossible, but highly improbable for a man with no criminal record and no history of violence. Furthermore, Walter had willingly agreed to a search of his property. Deputies spent 2 days combing through his farmhouse, his barn, and his acreage. They brought the tracking dogs. They inspected the floorboards. They checked the soil in the garden for any signs of recent digging. They found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of Hannah Brooks anywhere on Walter Dawson's land. With a solid alibi, zero physical evidence, and a demeanor that conveyed nothing but genuine heartbreak, the sheriff's department had no legal grounds to hold him. Walter was released. He walked out of the station, drove his brown truck back to his farm, and resumed his quiet life. The investigation slowly began to stall. Summer faded into autumn. The heavy green stalks of corn turned dry and brittle before being cut down by heavy machinery, leaving the fields barren and open to the cold wind. The missing posters pinned to the bulletin boards inside the local diner began to curl at the edges. Every time the phone rang in the Brooks household, Sarah would stop breathing for a fraction of a second, hoping to hear news, only to be met with the silence of another dead end. If you appreciate detailed investigations into forgotten cases and documentary stories that explore the complexities of true mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel. As the months passed without a single credible lead, a younger detective named Harris found himself unable to let the Dawson theory go. The timeline was tight, but the retired mail carrier's observation about the dog not barking continued to bother him. He believed Walter Dawson was the only suspect who fit the psychological profile. The problem was motive. Why would a solitary, religious, helpful neighbor who had never shown an ounce of hostility toward the Brooks family orchestrate the abduction of their child? Harris realized he was looking at the present when the answer might be buried in the past. He drove to the county courthouse in the center of town. He walked past the main offices and descended into the basement, where decades of property records, civil disputes, and zoning files were kept in long rows of metal filing cabinets. He began pulling every piece of paper associated with the Dawson and Brooks families, searching for any interaction that predated Hannah's birth. After 3 days of breathing in dust and reading through dry legal jargon, Harris found a thick manila folder dated 1982. It was a civil lawsuit regarding property lines. When David Brooks's father passed away, David inherited the sprawling farm. However, A significant parcel of that land, nearly 40 acres of prime, fertile soil bordering the creek, had been disputed for decades. The Dawson family claimed that an informal agreement made in the 1940s meant that specific section of land belonged to them. When David officially took ownership, he legally enforced the surveyed boundaries, effectively absorbing the 40 acres into his own operation. Walter Dawson's father, a proud and stubborn man, hired lawyers to fight the claim. The legal battle dragged on for nearly 3 years. The court eventually ruled in favor of the Brooks family, citing the official county maps and dismissing the handshake agreement as unenforceable. The financial toll of the lawsuit destroyed the Dawson farm. Walter's father lost his savings paying legal fees, suffered a massive heart attack less than a month after the final ruling, and died, leaving Walter with a fraction of the land and a heavy mortgage he could barely afford. Harris interviewed older residents who remembered the dispute. They painted a chilling picture of Walter. He never yelled. He never threatened David. He never threw a punch in the local tavern or caused a public scene. Instead, he simply watched. For more than 10 years, Walter Dawson quietly watched David Brooks build a highly successful, prosperous life on land that Walter believed had quite literally killed his father. Motive in criminal cases usually revolves around money, passion, or fear, but the most dangerous motive is quiet, patient resentment. A resentment that marinates for over a decade, hiding behind polite waves across a property line and shared pews in a Sunday church service. Harris believed Walter didn't take Hannah because he wanted a child. He took her because he knew it was the only way to make David Brooks feel the exact same depth of lifelong, unresolvable loss that Walter had experienced. It was an act of pure, calculated balancing of the scales. Armed with this motive, the tight timeline from the hardware store no longer looked like an alibi. It looked like a carefully constructed shield. Harris immediately drove back to the sheriff's department, laid the dusty property files on Miller's desk, and explained the theory. The quiet neighbor was not grieving with the family. He was watching his revenge unfold. Miller agreed they now had enough circumstantial evidence to bring Walter back in for a much more intense interrogation. They had a motive, they had a vehicle description, and they had witness testimony placing him on the road. It was enough to push for a confession. 2 unmarked police vehicles drove out to the Dawson property late that afternoon. The sky was overcast, threatening the first snow of the season. They pulled down the long dirt driveway. The property was dead quiet. The barn doors were closed and padlocked. The windows of the farmhouse were dark. The familiar brown pickup truck was nowhere to be seen. Sheriff Miller stepped out of his vehicle and walked toward the front porch. As he approached the steps, he noticed something driven into the frozen earth near the mailbox. It was a wooden sign. Printed across the front in bold red letters were 2 words, "For sale." Walter Dawson was gone, and whatever secrets he held about the afternoon of August 12 had vanished with him. Sheriff Miller and Detective Harris did not wait for a warrant. They walked up the wooden steps of the Dawson porch and knocked loudly. When the silence stretched on, Miller used his heavy flashlight to shatter a small pane of glass near the door handle. He reached inside, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed the door open. The farmhouse was perfectly cleanly empty. There were no dishes in the sink. There was no clothing in the closets. The floors had been swept. The furniture was gone. The dust that usually coats a rural farmhouse had been wiped away from the windowsills. This was not a panicked escape. This was a methodical, planned departure. A review of financial records over the next week revealed the depth of the deception. Walter Dawson had not listed his farm with a local real estate agent. Months before Hannah vanished, he had quietly contacted a commercial agricultural broker in another county. He sold the entire property to a corporate farming conglomerate at a significant discount, under the condition of a rapid cash-only closing. The funds had been wired to a regional bank, converted into cashier's checks, and withdrawn. When neighbors heard the news, they supplied their own narrative. The community consensus was that Walter, a solitary and emotional man, simply could not endure the heartbreak of the search. They believed living next to the Brooks family, seeing their daily grief had broken his spirit. The move was universally explained as an early, tragic retirement. No one questioned the timing. No one except Detective Harris. But suspicion is not evidence. Law enforcement cannot arrest a man simply for selling his own property and moving away, without a license plate track, without a destination, and most importantly, without any physical proof that Hannah had ever been inside his vehicle. The investigation hit an impenetrable wall. Walter Dawson had evaporated into the vast expanse of the American landscape. As weeks turned into months, the frantic energy of the initial search faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. The passing of time is the quietest enemy of any missing person investigation. Seasons cycled through the Ohio Valley. The corn grew tall, dried out, and was harvested. The snow fell and melted. David and Sarah Brooks aged prematurely, the stress etching deep lines into their faces. They kept the farm running, but the property felt entirely different. The laughter that once drifted across the front porch was replaced by the mechanical hum of tractors and the sound of the wind. At the sheriff's department, the thick binders containing Hannah's case file were moved from the active desk to a filing cabinet against the wall. Years later, they were moved into cardboard boxes in the basement archives. Sheriff Miller retired. Detective Harris eventually turned in his badge, carrying the weight of the unsolved Dawson theory into his own retirement. But inside the Brooks farmhouse, the calendar remained permanently fixed on a single date in August. For 25 years, Sarah Brooks refused to acknowledge the passage of time in the way the rest of the world did. She never removed the plastic bottle of bubble soap from the bottom step of the porch. When it cracked from winter ice, she left the plastic shards in the dirt. Every summer, on Hannah's birthday, Sarah observed her private ritual. She stood in her kitchen, her hands worn from decades of farm work, and baked a small vanilla cake. She sat at the table and wrote a letter detailing everything the family had done that year. She folded the letter and placed it inside a heavy cedar memory box, resting it gently against the stack of kindergarten worksheets, fading photographs, and the uneven, printed letters of a 5-year-old learning to write. 25 years passed. A quarter of a century of silence. Then the post office delivered the white envelope. The morning Sarah Brooks opened the birthday card, she did not cry. A deep physical shock rooted her to the kitchen floor. The card itself was unremarkable, a cheap piece of heavy stock paper with a generic floral design. But the single word written inside, in dull gray pencil, was impossible. Mom. The handwriting was not just similar to Hannah's. It was an exact, mechanical replication. The heavy pressure of the pencil, the slight leftward lean of the letters, the unique, looping curve of the mitt was a carbon copy of the worksheet sitting inside the cedar box. Sarah drove straight to the sheriff's department. The building had changed. The officers wore different uniforms. The dispatch system was entirely digital. A new investigator, Detective Reynolds, took the envelope from Sarah's shaking hands. Reynolds was born the same year Hannah disappeared. He knew the Brooks case only as a legendary ghost story taught to young deputies, as a cautionary tale about rural jurisdiction. But holding the card, Reynolds realized he was not looking at history. He was looking at active evidence. The envelope and card were immediately driven to the state crime laboratory. The forensic analysis over the next 48 hours yielded 3 critical turning points that resurrected the dead investigation. First, the document examiner placed the card under a high-resolution microscopic lens. By analyzing the pencil strokes, the examiner confirmed that the handwriting shared dozens of unique, microscopic characteristics with Hannah's preserved kindergarten papers. However, the examiner presented a terrifying psychological caveat. Human handwriting evolves. Muscle memory matures. It is biologically impossible for a 30-year-old adult to organically write with the exact fine motor instability of a 5-year-old child. The examiner concluded that the sender was not writing naturally. They were meticulously copying a physical reference. Someone, somewhere, was looking at a piece of Hannah's childhood writing and tracing the style by hand. Second, the forensic technicians treated the paper with a chemical vapor designed to reveal latent fingerprints. The results were chilling. The card and the inside of the envelope were entirely sterile. There were overlapping prints on the outside exterior, all belonging to the postal workers who had handled it during transit, but the sender had left nothing. They had either carefully wiped the paper clean with a cloth or worn gloves while writing and sealing the envelope. This was a deliberate, calculated act of concealment. Third, and most importantly, was the postage. The stamp had not been canceled by an Ohio sorting facility. It bore the faded ink ring of a regional post office located in a rural, heavily wooded county nearly 600 miles away in the Pacific Northwest. Whoever mailed the card had lived far away from the Ohio Valley for a very long time. Reynolds returned to his desk and pulled the archived files from the basement. He spread the yellowed type reports from 1995 across his desk. He read former Detective Harris's notes regarding the bitter land dispute. He read the retired mail carrier's statement about the brown pickup truck and the dog that didn't bark. Reynolds knew that in 1995, a man with cash could disappear into the American interior without leaving a paper trail. But the world had changed. In 2020, public records, digital census data, and interstate tax registries made true anonymity nearly impossible. Reynolds logged into the National Law Enforcement Database. He focused his search entirely on the county where the birthday card had been postmarked, filtering for the name Walter Dawson. He didn't find a driver's license. Walter Dawson had let his official identification expire a decade earlier. But Reynolds did find property tax records. A parcel of heavily forested land, 20 miles outside a small logging town, was registered to a W. Dawson. The taxes had been paid on time, every year, by mail, using a postal money order. Reynolds dug deeper. He accessed the archived federal census records for the year 2000, pulling the digital scan of the handwritten form submitted by that specific address. When the document loaded on his monitor, Reynolds stopped breathing. According to the official investigation from 1995, Walter Dawson was a solitary bachelor. He had no children. He had no living relatives. He had left Ohio entirely alone. But the year 2000 census form told a different story. Walter Dawson had claimed a dependent. Listed on the second line of the household registry, written in Walter's neat block handwriting, was a 10-year-old girl. Her name was listed as Claire Dawson. The age was an exact match. If Hannah Brooks were alive in the year 2000, she would have been exactly 10 years old. Reynolds felt the adrenaline spike in his chest. He reached for his phone and contacted the Vital Statistics office in the state where Walter resided. He requested an expedited search for a birth certificate matching the name Claire Dawson. 3 hours later, the encrypted file arrived in his inbox. The document was highly unusual. It was not a standard hospital birth record. It was classified as a delayed registration of birth. The certificate had been issued in late November of 1995, barely 3 months after Hannah Brooks vanished from her front yard. The document claimed Claire had been born at home, signed by a rural midwife who had passed away years ago. In an isolated community, it was authentic enough that local authorities had never found a reason to challenge it. Reynolds needed a timeline of her life. He contacted the county school district associated with Walter's property. He faxed his credentials and requested any archived educational records for a student named Claire Dawson. The district clerk was cooperative but confused. She explained that the records were remarkably thin. Claire had been enrolled in the local public elementary school halfway through the first grade. When Reynolds asked for medical history, vaccination records, or previous educational transcripts from kindergarten, the clerk paused. There were none. The enrollment file contained a handwritten note from Walter Dawson stating that the child had previously been homeschooled. The school district, lacking the strict enrollment verification protocols of modern education, had simply accepted the explanation and placed her in a classroom. On paper, Claire Dawson had virtually no documented existence before her 7th birthday. Reynolds began tracking down former teachers and classmates who still lived in the area. Most remembered Claire as a quiet, polite girl who kept to herself and was extremely close to her grandfather, Walter, who drove her to and from school every day in an old truck. But one former classmate, a woman who had shared a lunch table with Claire in the 2nd grade, recalled a strange conversation that had bothered her for years. She told Reynolds that Claire was highly intelligent, but seemed to lack basic understanding of how the world worked outside her home. One afternoon, while the class was celebrating a student's birthday, Claire had quietly leaned over and asked a question that made no sense to the other children. She had asked, "Can people have 2 birthdays?" The classmate had laughed it off, assuming it was a joke. Nobody thought much of it at the time. A child's confusion is rarely viewed as evidence of a crime. But sitting in his office 25 years later, Reynolds knew exactly what that question meant. It was the fractured memory of a traumatized 5-year-old, trying to reconcile the life she faintly remembered with the fabricated identity she had been given. If you appreciate detailed documentary storytelling and want to support the channel, consider subscribing to ensure you never miss an investigation. Reynolds had the census, the fraudulent birth certificate, the school records, and the handwriting analysis. The paper trail was undeniable. Walter Dawson had taken his neighbor's child, driven her across the country, and hidden her in plain sight by simply renaming her. But finding a paper trail is not the same as finding a person. Reynolds needed to know where she was right now. Claire Dawson was no longer a little girl riding in the passenger seat of a brown pickup truck. She was 30 years old. She was an adult with her own life. He submitted a request to the Interstate Department of Motor Vehicles asking for the most recent driver's license photo and registered address for Claire Dawson. 10 minutes later, the printer in the corner of the detective's office whirred to life. Reynolds stood up. He walked over and pulled the warm sheet of paper from the tray. He stared at the colored photograph printed in the center of the page. It showed a 30-year-old woman with light hair looking neutrally into the camera. Reynolds walked back to his desk. He reached into the original 1995 case file and pulled out a digital age progression photograph created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It was an artist's rendering of what Hannah Brooks might look like as an adult, based on the bone structure of her parents. He placed the DMV printout next to the artist's rendering. The resemblance was not subtle. The shape of the jawline, the spacing of the eyes, the slight asymmetry of the smile. It was the same person. The greatest breakthrough in the history of the county sheriff's department was sitting on a desk under the fluorescent lights. They had found Hannah Brooks. She was alive. But as Reynolds reached for his phone to coordinate a multi-state task force, a terrifying realization paralyzed him. They were about to knock on the door of a 30-year-old woman and completely destroy her reality. She was the one who had mailed the birthday card, which meant some part of her subconscious was seeking answers. Yet, according to every record Reynolds had pulled, Claire Dawson had spent the last 25 years believing the man who abducted her was a loving, devoted grandfather. In cases of long-term abduction, the greatest obstacle for law enforcement is often the psychological reality of the victim. Detective Reynolds understood that he could not simply fly across the country, knock on a door, and expect a 30-year-old woman to easily accept that her entire existence was a fabrication. Reynolds contacted the local county sheriff in the Pacific Northwest. Together they drove out to the address listed on the property tax records. The environment was a stark contrast to the flat, sun-baked cornfields of rural Ohio. The Dawson property sat at the end of a winding paved road, surrounded by towering pine trees and dense, damp undergrowth. The house was modest, well-maintained, and quiet. There were flower boxes under the windows. A reliable sedan was parked in the driveway. It looked like the home of an ordinary, responsible adult. Reynolds stepped onto the porch and rang the doorbell. When the door opened, the air left Reynolds' lungs. The woman standing in the doorway had light brown hair pulled back neatly. She was wearing a simple gray sweater. She looked at the two detectives with a polite, inquisitive expression. Reynolds recognized the slight asymmetry in her smile. He recognized the shape of her jawline. He was looking directly into the eyes of David Brooks. She introduced herself as Claire Dawson. She invited them inside, offering them coffee and directing them to sit in her neatly furnished living room. Reynolds did not use the aggressive tactics of an interrogation. He spoke softly, introducing himself as an investigator from Ohio looking into a very old missing persons case. He asked Claire if she would mind sharing a bit about her background. Claire answered freely, without any trace of nervousness. She explained that her parents had died in a severe car accident when she was just a toddler. She had no memory of them. Her grandfather, Walter Dawson, had taken her in and raised her. She described Walter with deep, genuine affection. She called him a devoted guardian who had homeschooled her through her early years, protected her, and provided a stable, loving home. Reynolds listened patiently. When she finished, he reached into his manila folder and pulled out the digital age progression photograph created by the state laboratory. He placed it gently on the coffee table in front of her. Claire leaned forward and looked at the image. She did not gasp. She did not break down in tears. A small furrow appeared on her brow, and she looked back at Reynolds, her expression shifting from polite hospitality to guarded confusion. She stated that the picture looked remarkably like her, but it was obviously some kind of coincidence. Reynolds softly explained the evidence. He mentioned the fraudulent birth certificate. He mentioned the lack of school records. He explained that Walter Dawson had lived next door to a family who lost a 5-year-old girl, and that he had moved away under highly suspicious circumstances shortly after. Claire's posture became rigid, the warmth drained from her voice. She pushed the photograph back across the table. She told Reynolds that he was mistaken. She insisted that Walter was a good, honest man, and that the police were confusing her with another missing child. Reynolds asked for a simple, voluntary DNA swab. He promised that if the results were negative, he would close the file and never bother her again. Claire politely but firmly refused. She explained that Walter was currently living in a palliative care facility in town. He was suffering from terminal heart failure and had only weeks left to live. She told the detectives that she would not subject the man who had loved and raised her to a baseless, stressful police investigation during his final days on Earth. She stood up from her chair and asked them to leave. Reynolds walked back to his rental car feeling a profound sense of defeat. The legal system operates on evidence, not intuition. Reynolds was dealing with an adult of sound mind who explicitly denied being the victim of a crime. Without her consent, obtaining a court-ordered warrant for her DNA required proving probable cause to a judge. But the evidence was entirely circumstantial, built on census anomalies and a 25-year-old timeline. Judges are historically hesitant to compel genetic testing on uncooperative adults without concrete physical proof. Reynolds returned to Ohio. He spent the next 3 weeks drafting affidavits, consulting with prosecutors, and trying to build a legal mechanism to force the test. Then, the phone rang. It was the local sheriff in the Pacific Northwest. Walter Dawson had passed away in his sleep at the hospice facility. The news brought the investigation to a devastating halt. The only man who knew exactly how Hannah Brooks had been taken from her front yard was gone. Law enforcement could not interrogate a ghost, and they could not force a grieving woman to dismantle her own identity. For a brief, agonizing moment, it seemed the truth would be buried with Walter. For Claire Dawson, the weeks following the funeral were a blur of quiet grief and overwhelming administrative tasks. The house she had grown up in suddenly felt vast and empty. She spent her evenings sorting through Walter's belongings, preparing the property for an eventual estate sale. One evening, while organizing heavy winter coats and old camping gear in the dimly lit attic, Claire stepped on a wooden floorboard that shifted slightly under her weight. She crouched down and pressed her hand against the wood. The board was not nailed to the joists like the others. She wedged her fingers into the narrow gap and pulled it upward. Beneath the dusty pink fiberglass insulation was a dark, recessed cavity. Resting inside was a heavy cedar chest, secured with a thick brass padlock. Claire had never seen it before. Walter had never mentioned it. In a house where she thought she knew every corner, this hidden compartment felt entirely alien. She carried the chest downstairs to the kitchen table. She went out to the garage, retrieved a heavy pair of steel bolt cutters from Walter's workbench, and returned to the kitchen. She positioned the metal jaws over the curved brass arm of the padlock and squeezed the handles together. The lock snapped with a sharp, heavy crack. Claire removed the broken padlock and slowly lifted the heavy wooden lid. The faint smell of old paper and dried lavender filled the room. The chest was not filled with family heirlooms or financial documents. It was a perfectly preserved archive of a tragedy she did not understand. Lying on top were dozens of yellowed newspaper clippings. Claire carefully picked up the first one. The bold headline read, "Massive Search for Hannah Brooks Enters Second Week." Beneath the headline was a photograph of a 5-year-old girl with blonde hair. Claire set the clipping down, her hands beginning to tremble slightly. She reached deeper into the chest. She pulled out a thick stack of glossy photographs. These were not formal portraits. They were candid, grainy images taken through a telephoto lens from a distance. They showed a man driving a green tractor across an open field. They showed a woman walking down a dirt driveway toward a rural mailbox. They showed a farmhouse with a wide front porch. The photographs were dated on the back in Walter's neat block handwriting, spanning across 2 decades. The man who raised her had been secretly watching and photographing these strangers for years. Beneath the photographs were the envelopes. There were 25 of them, neatly bound together with a piece of twine. None of them carried postage stamps. None of them had return addresses. Claire untied the twine and opened the top envelope. Inside was a letter written in a beautiful, flowing cursive. It began, "My dearest Hannah, today you would be 10 years old." Claire read the letter, the air growing thin in her lungs. She read about a mother's unending grief, about a birthday cake baked for a child who never came home, about a gray stuffed rabbit sitting on a bed that had not been slept in. She opened another letter, then another. Every single one was a raw, agonizing document of a mother bleeding her heart onto paper for a stolen daughter. They were signed by a woman named Sarah Brooks. Claire dropped the letters onto the table. Her mind was fracturing, desperately trying to build a wall between the loving grandfather who had packed her school lunches and the terrifying reality of the evidence sitting in front of her. She reached into the very bottom of the empty chest. Her fingers brushed against a single sheet of faded, lined kindergarten paper. Printed across the top in uneven, heavy pencil marks was the name Hannah. The H leaned slightly to the left. The A possessed a distinct, looping curve. Next to the worksheet lay a sealed white envelope. Written across the front, in the familiar handwriting of the man who had defined her entire life, were 6 words. "For Claire, when I am gone." She stared at the envelope, her heart hammering a violent rhythm against her ribs. The documentary evidence of a stolen life was spread across her kitchen table, but the final, impossible question remained sealed inside the paper. She was moments away from understanding not just who she was, but exactly why a quiet, gentle man had committed the worst act of her life. Claire's fingers moved carefully across the edge of the envelope. It had been sealed for an unknown number of years, waiting patiently at the bottom of a wooden box. She broke the seal, unfolded the single sheet of lined paper, and began to read the last words Walter Dawson would ever speak to her. The handwriting was neat, steady, and unapologetic. "My dearest Claire, or perhaps I should call you Hannah. If you are reading this, I am gone, and the cowardice that defined my life has outlasted me." In the quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by the towering pines of the Pacific Northwest, Claire read a confession that methodically dismantled her entire reality. Walter did not write about the abduction as a crime of passion. He explained the bitter, devastating reality of the 1980s property dispute. He described watching his father's health fail under the weight of legal debts. While David Brooks expanded a prosperous farm on land the Dawsons believed was their birthright, Walter wrote about the slow, silent poison of resentment. He had never planned to harm the Brooks family. But on the humid afternoon of August 12, 1995, he drove his truck past their property and saw 5-year-old Hannah standing near the gravel road. The family dog, recognizing the quiet neighbor who often helped repair fences, simply wagged its tail. Walter stopped the truck. He rolled down the window. He asked Hannah if she wanted to come see a newborn calf at his farm. Trusting him completely, she climbed into the passenger seat. The confession revealed that Walter never intended for the abduction to be permanent. His original plan, fueled by a decade of silent bitterness, was to keep Hannah hidden at his farm for a few weeks, just long enough to make David Brooks experience the exact same feeling of total, unresolvable loss that had destroyed his own family. But within hours, the massive county search began. The flashing lights surrounded the property. Walter panicked, knowing that returning her now would mean a federal kidnapping charge and decades in prison. He packed his truck, sold the farm through a broker, and drove west into the American interior. The most agonizing revelation in the letter was the moment Walter decided to never go back. During their first month on the road, staying in cheap motels under assumed names, he had tried to keep his emotional distance. But one evening, terrified by a thunderstorm, the 5-year-old girl ran to him, held onto his leg, and called him Grandpa. Walter wrote that the word shattered him. He convinced himself that returning her to Ohio would not just destroy his life, but would inflict catastrophic psychological trauma on the child. He chose to believe that keeping her was an act of protection. He gave her a new name, a fabricated birth certificate, and a quiet, stable life hidden in the woods. Claire lowered the letter. The silence in the kitchen felt incredibly heavy. She looked at the broken padlock resting on the table, and she finally allowed herself to confront a memory she had desperately tried to bury. Detective Reynolds believed the birthday card had arrived out of nowhere, an unexplainable miracle of timing. But looking at the kindergarten worksheet sitting next to the confession, Claire accepted the truth. Recovered memories had not prompted the card. 6 months earlier, on her 30th birthday, Walter had gone to the hospital for his initial hospice evaluation. Left alone in the house, Claire had searched the attic for his medical insurance documents. She had stepped on the loose floorboard. She had found the chest. She had broken the original lock. Inside, she had found the chest. She had broken the original lock. Inside, she had found the kindergarten worksheet bearing the name Hannah and the unmailed letters addressed to Sarah Brooks in Ohio. In a state of absolute terrified dissociation, unable to comprehend what she was looking at, yet feeling a deep, instinctual pull toward the name on the paper, she had taken a pencil, traced the 5-year-old handwriting to see if her muscles remembered the shapes, and mailed the card to the Ohio address. Then, terrified by the possibility that her entire life was a lie, she had driven to the hardware store, purchased a new brass padlock, secured the chest, and shoved it back beneath the floorboards. When Detective Reynolds arrived on her porch weeks later, she had fiercely defended Walter, hiding behind denial because acknowledging the truth while the man who raised her was dying felt impossible. But the man was dead now, and the truth was sitting on the kitchen table. Claire picked up her phone. Her hand was steady. She dialed the number for the county sheriff's department in Ohio and asked to speak with Detective Reynolds. When he answered, she spoke only 3 words. "I am ready." The legal and scientific machinery of a missing persons investigation moves incredibly fast when the barriers are removed. Reynolds coordinated with local authorities in the Pacific Northwest. A buccal swab was taken from Claire's cheek in a quiet medical clinic. The sample was expedited to the state crime laboratory in Ohio. 48 hours later, the forensic results confirmed what the handwriting analysis had already suggested. The genetic markers were a perfect, undisputed match to David and Sarah Brooks. Claire Dawson did not exist. The logistics of returning a missing child are rarely as simple as they appear in fiction. There was no media circus. There were no press conferences. Reynolds arranged for a private flight, ensuring Hannah was shielded from the public eye. When the rental car turned off the county highway and onto the long dirt driveway of the Brooks farm, Hannah stared out the window, searching for a feeling of home. The late summer heat was identical to the day she vanished. The cornfields stretched out toward the horizon. David and Sarah Brooks were standing on the front porch. They looked older, fragile, their faces lined by 25 years of ambiguous grief. Hannah stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. She walked slowly toward the porch. There was no immediate weeping embrace. The reality of the moment was far more complicated. Hannah looked at the farmhouse, the oak tree, the porch steps. Her mind searched for a connection, an anchor, a spark of recognition, an anchor, a spark of recognition. But the landscape of her childhood had been paved over by decades of false memories in a different state. She looked at the 2 strangers crying on the porch, feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt that she could not remember her own parents. Sarah saw the hesitation in her daughter's eyes. She understood that biology could not instantly bridge a quarter-century of absence. Sarah turned, walked into the house, and returned a moment later holding something small. She walked down the wooden steps, closed the distance between them, and gently placed an object into Hannah's hands. It was the gray stuffed rabbit. Hannah looked down at the worn, faded fabric. She ran her thumb along the material. As her finger moved over the left ear, she felt something hard and distinct. It was a row of heavy, clumsy black stitches. The tactile sensation of the heavy thread bypassed the walls of her conscious memory. A flash of the past broke through the dark. The heat of a summer afternoon. A needle pulling heavy black thread. The rhythmic thumping of a dog's tail against the wooden porch. A soft, reassuring voice saying, "It means he's brave." The memory was real. It belonged to her. The fabricated identity of Claire Dawson fractured entirely, leaving only the truth underneath. Hannah fell to her knees in the dirt driveway, her hands clutching the rabbit to her chest, as 25 years of stolen grief poured out of her. Sarah dropped down beside her, wrapping her arms around her daughter. The two of them anchored together in the dust of the farm. In the weeks that followed, Detective Reynolds traveled to the Pacific Northwest to fully process the contents of the cedar chest. What he found inside provided the final, heartbreaking layer to the investigation. Walter Dawson had not simply stolen a child and walked away. He had spent the rest of his life being crushed by the weight of his own decision. Reynolds discovered a stack of motel receipts and detailed personal journals. They proved that every August for 25 years, Walter had driven across the country. He had parked his truck on the rural county roads of Ohio. He had watched the Brooks farmhouse from a distance, capturing the grainy telephoto images of the family aging without their daughter. Walter's journals described a man trapped in a prison of his own making. He wrote extensively about his guilt. He realized early on that confessing to the crime would rip Hannah away from the only life she knew, destroying her sense of identity. Yet, remaining silent meant the Brooks family would never stop bleeding. He chose to carry the sin, playing the role of a loving grandfather while knowing he was a monster. For Hannah, the aftermath of the discovery presented an impossible emotional conflict. The justice system offers clear definitions of right and wrong, but human emotion does not. Hannah could not excuse Walter's crime. He had stolen her family, her name, and her entire history over a bitter land dispute. Yet she could not erase the fact that this same man had read her bedtime stories, taught her how to drive, paid for her education, and provided a home filled with genuine affection. She was faced with the agonizing task of reconciling her hatred for the man who abducted her, with her love for the man who raised her. It is a burden unique to victims of long-term familiar abduction, a grief that cannot be easily categorized by law enforcement or understood by the public. The case of Hannah Brooks remains one of the most remarkable resolutions in the history of missing children. But the greatest twist was not simply that she survived. The true weight of the story is that both families spent 25 years living inside different versions of the exact same tragedy. One mother never stopped looking for a daughter she believed was gone. One daughter never knew she was supposed to be looking for a mother. And one man spent the remainder of his life imprisoned by a decision made out of quiet revenge rather than violent hatred. The birthday card that arrived in Ohio was not just a piece of forensic evidence. It was the first honest action Hannah unknowingly took in 2.5 decades. It was a single word, traced in the handwriting of a lost 5-year-old, that reached across the country and demanded the truth. It allowed a family to step out of a 25-year pause, reclaim their stolen history, and begin the slow, quiet work of coming home.